As we begin, I acknowledge the Medical people, the traditional custodians of this land. I pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are here tonight. Welcome to our annual Donald K. Turner Lecture. I would like to acknowledge the gifts of Jean Wilsford, who established this lecture in honour of her father to celebrate his contributions to architecture in Australia. This annual lecture is presented each year by an eminent architect, and it is our pleasure to have our newest Professor of Practice, Rachel Neeson, the Director of Neeson Murcutt Architects, presenting tonight's Utzon Lecture and Donald K. Turner Lecture, The House in the City, the Child in the Sports Hall. Rachel Neeson formed Neeson Murcutt Architects with her late partner, Nicholas Murcutt, in 2004. Based in Sydney, the practice pursues a range of project types across Australia, from bespoke houses to housing prototypes, multi-unit housing, public and community projects, sports facilities and schools. Neeson Murcutt Architects is one of very few smaller practices to have been awarded the highest professional accolade across diverse categories of public architecture, urban design, interior architecture, heritage, education and residential architecture. Rachel studied architecture at the University of Sydney, graduating with the University Medal in 1993. She was awarded the Board of Architects 2002 Byra Hadley Travelling Scholarship and completed a Master of Architecture in Barcelona. Rachel currently serves on design advisory panels for the City of Sydney and Landcom. In 2016, Neeson Murcutt Architects was joined by Dr. Stephen Neal, formerly of Perth-based practice Pendle and Neal. Rachel has been an adjunct professor at the University of Sydney and is now a professor of practice at UNSW Built Environment, and our first woman in this role. Join me in welcoming Rachel Neeson to the stage.
Thank you, Bruce. Hello, everybody. Thank you to the University of New South Wales for this appointment, and hello to my colleagues out there, many who I know from the past, and thank you to some of my staff who've come tonight, and to Stephen and some friends. The House in the City, the Child in the Sports Hall. The house is recognised as one of the most complex architectural problems. It is multifunctional, fundamentally private, and loaded with the expectation of becoming home, sanctuary and refuge. For many architects, residential work, alterations and additions, single apartment fit-outs and new houses forms the nascence of their practice. A growing number of such offices in Sydney are now participating in public and larger private projects, making significant pieces of the city. We are one such office and have been now for some time. The reasons for this are quite interesting. The established pathway has been through open public competition, although few and far between. The Green Square Library, for example, won by Stuart Hollenstein, and Gunyama Aquatic Centre, won by Andrew Burgess Architects and Grimshaw. But we're also seeing a culture change through public policy, with procurement protocols increasingly encouraging smaller practices in the mix for these commissions, either as collaborators with bigger players or as architects in their own right. At state level, the New South Wales Government Architect Strategy and Design Excellence Scheme clearly advocates for this, whilst locally, the City of Sydney has supported a diversity of practice scale for well over a decade through its public projects procurement and in large private development under its more recent competitive design policy. So, clearly a museum or a sports facility is not like a house. But is there something about an architecture practice honed on houses that translates productively and insightfully? Unlike processes that make other buildings, there is a proximity to client, site, and the building process in the making of a house, a direct cause and effect that affords a particular experience. So in this lecture, I will explore how critical thinking migrates across scales in our work through a series of themes or filters, and how that impacts on the material realisation of these projects. I'll start in the past. We are fundamentally curious about how places have come to be. We mine the past in order to understand the present. We're interested in the measurable, so the traceable changes of a place, and the less tangible, the stories. We are naturally drawn to the richness of layered places, those which have made change without the wiping of everything that's come before. We see our work in a continuum of time. We mine the past, therefore, in order to project a future. And we often conflate the past in the present through our architecture. The first project I'm going to show you is sited in Castle Crag. And actually our client, Jo Nolan, is sitting in the second row. Thank you, Jo, for coming. So in the house that we designed for Jo and her family, Castle Crag, the past is understood as multi-dimensional. So we think of its Indigenous past, and the street is actually a ridge street, which is, we all know, with a pathways chosen by traditional owners to move through their land. But also we think of the creation of this suburb by the Griffins. And this is an interesting, fascinating slide actually, because the Griffins' idealisation of the suburb was about living in bush. And of course, to make that suburb, the bush is decimated. So the whole thing really is a fabrication. But we also think about architectural legacy. And Nick and I felt very privileged to be asked to do a house in Castle Crag with a lineage of not only the Griffins building houses here, but also Ruth and Bill Lucas, Brewick and Muller. The site, it stretches down to the water. Is a very steep site. And the fourth component of the past that was very important in this site in this project was the past of the clients themselves. So the personal memory or nostalgia. So this house was built by Jo's husband's grandparents after the war. It was built out of recycled materials. And the family had acquired the house from the family estate, and they felt a responsibility in respecting the memory for the extended family. The site has a beautiful rock on the street. It has bush to one side, and it stretches out to water. These are sort of the aspects of the Griffin site, I guess, the Griffin past. And this drawing that Nick and I did, our hands one laid over the other, responds to Griffin's site, if you like, with a room to the rock, a room to the bush, and a room to the view. And that really set up this pinwheel plan. You can see it's almost a direct translation from that sketch. You enter directly into around the rock, directly into the kitchen. This is the living room, and this is the cosy lounge. So what's important here is the material of Castle Crag, so defined by rock, and Griffin's work with rock and concrete really become the material of the house. So in the kitchen you are, it's almost like a cave where the rock comes into the house, as opposed to the living room, which is about precipice and looking out to the water. The cosy lounge has a fireplace, which is here. And we all know that if you get more than about 1.5 meters away from a traditional fireplace, you won't feel any warmth. So that's why the lounge is so small. But this is one of the elements that we retained in situ. So here was the house as it was. We actually retained the fireplace in that wall. And we left the story of the marks that we had made on that house in the architecture. We mixed recycled brick from the house with new recycled brick that we sourced elsewhere as the materials of the project, the past being evident in the material of the house. Sitting in its bush setting, another aspect of this project was it sits within a bushfire zone. And this, I guess, is Griffin's idealised suburb that you connect to landscape. This is sort of poses an alternate connection through reflection, and you're not actually connected to landscape, but you're looking at a reflection of it. This is an image of a project by Andy Goldsworthy that we found well after we completed this next project, which is the Shipwreck Lookout. The Shipwreck Lookout is located at the end of Homebush Bay in Sydney Olympic Parklands. And this is a place which has an industrial past and kind of an ecological past and present. There are 5 shipwrecks that remain visible above the shallow water at the end of Homebush Bay. And these are there from a time when the bay was used for shipwrecking. So there's nothing actually significant about any of these ships, but the bay is so contaminated that you can't actually move them. And mangroves have housed inside them, and the mangroves are protected under a replacement policy, so you can't actually remove these things. And our brief was to provide a safe lookout that was accessible to all, that kept the public off the delicate saltbush, that protected mangroves, protected the headland, actually, the little peninsula point, from the encroachment of mangroves, because that point is protected under treaties between China and Japan and Australia for migrating birds, and they won't roost there if the mangroves encroach. So there was a whole lot of kind of very interesting conflicts, if you like. We were drawn to this book by Lucy Lippard, and through this project we really looked at the history, or the past, the history of lookouts, which evolved in the Romantic period, and lookouts basically entice the visitor to look at a view that has been chosen for you. And we, in a way, took this a step further by looking to design what we called looking devices, so that people would come to look at these shipwrecks or whatever, but they'd actually look at a reflection of it through a telescope or a mirror. The mirror was also a way of enabling people to look into the adjacent crane lighters if they were in a wheelchair. So that was our way around avoiding a 30-metre long ramp. This is sort of the idea of those things. We use little metal platforms and the material coming out of the past being the ships, to get up close to them. We made as narrow a pathway as we could to give the sense of discovering a shipwreck. So these look like they've almost fallen off a boat. The little peninsula was man-made. It was created to cart bricks from the nearby brick pit, load them onto barges, and this is a pile of bricks we found when we first came to the site. So this history, this industrial history of the site, became the material of the lookout platform, where we contrasted very precise bricks, like the sort of precision of sort of nautical sort of navigation, and these strewn bricks as a way of creating an intertidal zone that would preclude mangroves from encroaching. So not legislated history, but in this next project, which is a competition entry that we didn't quite win for the Female Factory in Hobart, the Female Factory is one of 11 convict sites, female convict sites around Australia, and it is World Heritage listed. So there were originally 5 yards. It's in the shadow of Mount Wellington, literally in the shadow. It's also in the flood zone of an adjacent creek, so it was very difficult conditions. And these women would journey from England, and then they'd journey from the cove up to this site. And they'd journey in the middle of the night so as not to be harassed by the male convicts. Our approach to this quite harrowing history was one of inversion. So, and this, I think this diagram shows it quite beautifully, that this valley would become a public walk, and this space would be actually a public space, and then the museum, if you like, would be these 2 yards either side. So where there were compounds, there's open space. Where there was austerity, there would be sensual richness. Where there was division, there'd be joining together, and where there was controlled movement, there would be freedom of movement. So here's that public space. You come in, this is the visitor centre at the rear. And the elements of the walkway, like the cloister, the female cloister, mark, which are around here, they mark the height of the walls as they were once. These women would pick the tar off the ropes from the boats. They actually would do all the laundry from the hospitals, and they'd make uniforms for soldiers. So cloth was what they did on a daily basis, so work was to do with cloth, and they wore a yellow C on their uniforms for criminal class. And so we worked with Sue Barnsley and her team to evolve this luxuriant garden of yellow meadow and yellow flowers, and the building was essentially made of cloth, with rooms defined by cloth. And sort of tapping into the sort of seasonal grassland calendar. Settings, it's my second theme. We prefer to think of settings rather than sites because it implies breadth. So we think of geology and topography and that relationship then to hydrology and landscape and urban context and microclimate. Philip Thallis introduced me to Norman Self, who wrote about Sydney in 1906. The outline of the present city bears a rough resemblance to the back of a right hand severed at the wrist, Cleveland Street, its southern boundary, being the line of severance. Laying the palm on the table, the thumb represents Piedmont, the long space, Darling Harbour, the forefinger, the York Street Ridge, ending with Millers Point and Dawes Point, the middle finger, the Macquarie Street Ridge, ending at Fort Macquarie, now Sydney Opera House, the third finger, the Domain, ending at Mrs Macquarie's chair, and the fourth finger, the Darlinghurst Ridge, ending at Potts Point, with Rushcutters Bay as the eastern boundary. Now, the original settlement was practically all embraced in the narrow area represented by the first and second fingers. I'm really drawn to the way that Self connects topography to the human body, about scaling and abstracting. So we understand setting definitely at a physical level, but we also, like Self, conceive it at an abstract level. And we find this important in achieving resonance with a place. So again, starting with a house. And this is a house in coastal Bronte. It's incredible sort of geological sandstone place. Where the scale of the beaches, Tamarama and Bronte, is quite small, they feel like rooms made of stone, and they're fed by these gullies which actually retain public parkland. So there's a landscape and a hydrological and a geological sort of setting to these places. There's also an aspect of public domain. So this is a large double block here, and this dotted red line is a very popular little pedestrian walk from people who live up on the ridge down to the beach. So it has a public component to this house as well. And you can see this is an image taken from that public walk. So views across the roof to the beach or to the ocean were very important. And it has a tree, a magnificent, well, it doesn't have a tree. There's a beautiful street tree, a magnificent fig tree that also sort of figures in our thinking around this project. And the house that was on the site had a beautiful garden. And whilst this image here looks very much like the house is built right up against the street, actually on the other side it gives garden back to the street. So it's also about garden. There's a little sandstone cliff that runs diagonally through the site. And perhaps it was because Nick and I had just been to Cambodia and Angkor Wat that we imagined this house engulfed in garden. But there's something about the geological presence of rock on this site. And so we worked with concrete as a material that weathers beautifully with rock. And we used it in a way that cut horizontal laminas like sedimentary rock. So we used second and third and fourth hand formwork to cut these bands of concrete. And then we worked with landscape architect Daniel Bafsky from 360 Degrees to engulf the house in garden. This is the little cliff that runs through the site itself. So that cliff organises the site into an upper part and a lower part. And the upper part is here, that's where the main house is, it sort of hugs the corner of the site. And in the lower part like in a sort of natural setting, the lower part holds a water hole, a pool. So the square site, the house tucked into the corner, and this is the sort of most important room of the house, really. It looks diagonally across the garden to the distant ocean because the diagonal is the greatest extent of view. This is the biggest house we've ever had a brief for, and our response to the brief for a big house was to give them a big garden. So it's a strategy for a big garden. So that's looking from inside that space, where again we've used sandstone, and it's thick stone. It's not a thin laminate, it's a thick stone on the floor to bring the sense of the garden right into the house. And literally the garden into the house through planters. And then the house itself extends out into the landscape, so it's cantilevered at either ends, and all the pathways in the house become pathways in the landscape. They sort of become blended, if you like, with the contours of the garden. Framing views and using the house also to edit views of neighbours. As you move up through the house, the materials get darker, and as you move down, the materials get lighter. And then at the lower level, where we've got lots of bedrooms, there's 4 boys in this house, you can see how the corridors, hallways always end in garden. And then they become pathways that take you through the garden, down the stairs to this lower part of the garden, up the stairs. There's circuits that run through the house and garden together. That's looking at that lower corridor out to that rear garden, the side garden. That's on the south side of a 2-storey building. It's kind of remarkably verdant. And the cantilever out on the northern edge. So we retained lots of trees, and then we imported lots more trees into the site, and we retained existing cliff and boulders and relocated cliff and boulders. And this is then looking down into that lower garden, which holds the pool like a waterhole, and this cabana space really gives life to this pool. And you can see the floor material continues in, and even the landscape continues in. So it's a real sort of melding of the landscape setting and the house. Okay. Prince Alfred Park Pool is a strategy entirely derived from its setting, 7.5 hectares in dense urban Sydney. Newington Armoury, out near Sydney Olympic Parklands, is also a piece of architecture, if you like, that derives its architecture from its setting. And in this instance, the strategy is about camouflage, because these are World War II armament bunkers, essentially. But we were working on this project as a master plan at the same time we were doing Prince Alfred Park. So Prince Alfred Park had a vibrant past. It was the setting for the intercolonial exhibitions. It was also, from the 1950s, the setting for a pool and ice skating rink. But when we came to see it, it was actually quite a seedy park. Our brief was accompanied by a police report, just to make sure we knew how dangerous it really was. And yet it had this beautiful pastoral quality that somehow reminded us of this, or made us imagine this Victorian past. In the middle of the park was the pool building, the pool services building, which really interrupted this sort of pastoral feel and added to its seedy kind of character, blocking views across it. So very simply, we removed the pool buildings and buried them under a park which we folded up and over the top, and then we used landscape mounds as a way of softening and also sharpening the presence of the pool in the park. Another very important thing was that we packed activities along the edge of the railway line, along this shareway, to give it a sort of vibrancy, including fitness nodes around the park. So we really tried to bring activity to the park, recalling the activity of the past. We worked with Sue Barnsley on this project, I should add. So you can see here the folded landscape over the building and the scale of the park. So the architecture responds to the scale of the setting, but also responds to the intimacy of the act of swimming and changing and swimming. We used mounds to contain the contaminated spoil. So the presence not only of the pool but also the ice skating rink, which is an external rink, left a lot of toxicity in the soil. So we used the mounds as a way of dealing with that on site, and also as a way of separating, connecting park and pool, and dealing also with the microclimate, so just taking the edge off some of the winds in the park, so you could sit out of the wind. And it forms this kind of beautiful space and this beautiful acoustic space. So when you stand up here, you can hear the splashing of lap swimmers. You can't actually hear the buses on Cleveland Street and Chalmers Street. It's a long line in the landscape when it folds down at either end. And the material of the tile reflects the water in the pool. At the same time as being a building that's essentially underground, we worked very hard to deny this. So I think this photograph shows it quite well. We worked very hard to make this feel like it was sort of floating. And these are the change rooms here. This is essentially the services plant room, which includes capacity for future trigen, and the cafe, and then administration up the end near the toddler splash deck. So the big light funnels were a way of dealing with the fact that you're underground. Also bringing a balance of light, so pulling in light from the east, and also providing privacy to the apartments behind. So dealing with the setting in a very kind of direct way. The section is very intimate. Here it's only 2 metres. We had to get a dispensation from our certifier for only being 2 metres. And you can really, the tiles come around like this, and you can sort of touch the material of the tile on the back wall. And then the skylights are oversized, so there's this sort of play between monumental and intimate in this project. This is also a very important little diagram in context of setting, because it's a concrete pattern for the pavement. So we used stripes as a way of breaking up the expanse of the concourse, and also a way of connecting concourse with wall, really emphasising the topographic quality of the project rather than the tectonic quality of the project. The other elements that were needed in the park that were not to do with topography were treated as follies, I guess a bit like the Victorian folly in the park. You can see here the co-location of the little toddler playground with the cafe. And we used a grove of palm trees to bring shade to this area. Okay, the roof was quite a tricky component. So here we have the palm trees and the toddler splash deck at one end, and down this end, underneath here, is the plant room and the trigen. And pools are incredibly corrosive environments, as you know, even external pools. So these, a lot of fluing to do with the services and skylights. So we collaborated with Sonde van der Haar on these chimneys. They're an artwork. They're called Shades of Green, because although you're burning gas to create your electricity, it's still non-renewable. But the most important material of the project is, of course, the meadow. And Sue Barnsley did an incredible job selecting a variety of different native species that would flower throughout the year. Connected to the idea of a pool in a park, of course, is how to fence it. And this beautiful running fence project by Christo inspired an approach to the fence, where if we had a mesh fence that could duck and dive over our roof and in and around the meadow mounds, that you would never see it in its entirety. So you'd never feel like you're being kept out of something or enclosed within something. You'd only ever see part of a fence. And sometimes the fence is quite invisible, and other times it's more visible. And the other component, of course, to do with setting is the shade. And if you want to have school carnivals at a pool, you need to have complete shade over your bleachers. So we introduced the idea of umbrellas. And the thought here was that we might find that some people will put up the umbrellas and other people will leave it down, trying to cater to the sunbathers as well as the people who live under a hat like I do. But it really creates a dynamic, a dynamism within the park. Whenever you walk past or drive past, you might see all the umbrellas up or only a few umbrellas up, so it gives it a real sort of living vibrancy through the material of the architecture. And that's that major park pathway, as we finished it. We embrace limits as a creative opportunity. And I love this project, this little pavilion by Decoupled Architects, because it seems almost that architecture is limitless in this project. So limits might be a boundary, they might be a set of regulations, they might be an actual physical condition, but they're productive to our design process and often generative of our design solutions. This is a house at Whale Beach that Nick and I designed some years back, and you can see from this little topographic diagram that it is very steep. Has beautiful views to Creel Head, but it has a huge escarpment right behind it, so it's really challenged for sun. So steepness was, I guess, the first limit, and this was a little exploration in how do you make 60-odd stairs feel manageable to your front door. So this was really exploring architectural promenade and connecting that to how we would manage landscape. And then secondly, the planning regulations were quite challenging. So the setbacks, trying to catch any piece of north sun that we possibly could, and also maintaining our neighbours' views. So I think it's a project that might look from the outside like it's sort of a sculpted thing, but actually it's all sort of almost mapped. So each level actually is completely different to the level above, depending on the sort of planning regulations at that level. So this is the ground floor. And I might also add that it was a 300 square metre house brief, and on a steep site, that can be quite imposing. So we were looking for devices to dematerialise the mass of the house, trying to make it feel like it doesn't overwhelm its sort of site. So this is a Cadurk house, Castle Galde, in just north of Barcelona, and there's a opening through the house here. So this is the opening cut through the middle of our house here. It takes little cues from this project. When you come up those stairs, you come into an incredible thin part of the plan. On one side's the living room, and this is the dining room. The architectural promenade, in a sense, continues into the house through step levels, which also help with views. And then the top floor, trying to deal with that 2-storey height limit. So the third storey actually isn't a third storey, it's really second storey, but it's incredibly constrained in this little corner of the site here. So that leads to this sort of winding sense through the house. This is the main level. As you wind, almost as if you're walking along a contour on that steep kind of precipice. And it speaks to the proximate view, the view that you can open the back door and step into, which is also very beautiful. And then set against that then is the horizon and the headland, the sort of majestic view. So it works with proximity and distance. And it's shaped by its kind of planning limits. We also use different material to help dematerialise the mass of the house. So the upper level is clad in timber, and being a bushfire 3 zone, it was called at the time, this is a spotted gum, a fire-resistant timber, and then we use that to derive the interior architecture of the house too. So this is the upper floor, which is all this, timber, like a little timber room with timber fire shutters, and it's very tiny and intimate, almost like being on a boat. This is, we're back in Bronte, I think you might have seen that image before. And this is actually the house that Stephen and I made for ourselves. It's just across the road from the park that leads down to the beach. And there's the rub, because that road is very noisy. It was a nondescript bungalow, and the limit here was the condition of the traffic. So the project cuts out a courtyard and literally replaces that floor area on the south side of the house. The materials of the house are insulated cavity brick for the low decibels, and 10.8 mil glass, which was a cost-effective way of achieving sort of acoustic. And what that means is the house opens to the interior, but actually it starts to privileged view, because you can't hear anything through that glass. It literally is just something you see. So the dining table's drawn on the plan because there's key views north, south, east and west. I literally cut a hole in the house, and luckily the road's a little lower, so you can, with a bit of planting, mostly not see the traffic, and that somehow helps you not hear the traffic if you can't see the traffic. And literally a hole in the house, a hole in the roof, sorry. And we craned in a tree. So this is then looking east towards the garden and the ocean horizon, and then looking north towards the street. So we stepped this level up so that you can retain a window and have some sort of communication with the street, because the floor level is basically the same level as the footpath. And that all works fine until someone unexpectedly very tall walks past and you get a bit of a shock. And then this is the view back to the courtyard west, and down this is the old wall of the house, and these are the bedrooms. And then through this sort of black reflective portal to the south, which is just green, full of green and garden. It reflects at night. Limits in a public building. So this is a surf club, about 500 kilometres north of Sydney. Crescent Head, it's just on the coast from Kempsey. Beautiful little fishing and surfing spot, iconic surfing spot, as you can see from this postcard. Long board nose break, I'm told. Incredible distant views to Hat Head National Park, intimate views to the Little Killick Creek, where kids and families love to hang. And that was the surf club. Yes, troubled by concrete cancer and not really taking any advantage of its setting. And this was the most important drawing. So this is the legal document that defines the site, and the club has a lease in perpetuity with Crown Lands for $200 a year. And basically our brief was, if you so much as hang a gutter over that, over that boundary, we lose our lease. So the challenge was therefore to somehow relate this given plot to this magnificent site. Luckily, if we built the full 2 stories, we'd be over the 500 square metre limit, which then triggered the need for a second, for a fire booster pump, which was about $250,000. So we used that limit in order to deal with the other limit. By carving space out, that meant that we could feel like we were addressing the site. So the kiosk, the lower level, faces Hat Head. The function room up the top, the entry looks back to the town. That one end looks to the horizon, the other one along the beach, and then the little balcony faces you back to the creek. And that's the kind of sense of it. It was important, this is a comment that Stephen made actually, that this building somehow feels like it belongs there. It had to have a sort of beachy quality, whatever that meant. And the way we interpreted that really was that it needed to feel like a building and around. So we were looking for a material that we could clad not only the walls but also the roof with. It's also, not a particularly wealthy demographic, and we were lucky to get federal funding of $2.4 million, supplemented by sausage sizzles, so not a lot extra. So here it is in its setting, from the hill above the creek, from the beach, and a bit closer from the beach. It sort of has this 3-dimensional quality. And you might see at the kiosk end, that's actually the boundary. And if you look at that seat, you'll see it's actually just cut off on the boundary with a little bit of tolerance. I think we gave ourselves 70 mil tolerance for that. So the planning, the legislative definition of the site actually kind of formed the building. The second thing was, only 40 metres from breaking surf, we had to have materials that would be robust. And $2.4 million, we couldn't afford to do a concrete structure with tile all over it because it would just be so heavy we'd end up spending half our money in the ground. So it's got a concrete block structure with brick on the outside up to level 1 that could support the slab so that we could have fire compartment that was different for the function space above to this sort of club operations on the lower floor. We used off-the-shelf brick colours that just so happened to work very well with the beach. And we were able to find tiles that just so happened to match exactly the colours and just so happened to be exactly the right size that fitted into an off-the-shelf slate system, like a lightweight slate system roof. So it's actually a ply roof with a membrane with this sort of tile/slate rain screen roof, if you like. The patternation, we used the colours to accentuate different corners to really try to speak to that idea of orientation of the legal lot, I guess, in the context of the site. And I just love this image because it speaks about how we work in the office, and it speaks about that translation of scale from a 1 to 200 model to the construction photograph. There are a few drawings in between and that sense of that space as it's finished. So the 5 major openings direct to the 5 aspects we identified as being important to the site, and wherever else we needed windows, the bricks just became a brick screen. That's into the one of the change room areas. And I like this image because it somehow speaks to Jai Kung's little sort of hovering pavilion image that I showed in the first slide of this section. The sort of vibrancy that a project like this can provide to a town, even with all these limits. What prevails? What prevails is about architectural judgment. It's how you edit. It's what you choose to retain, to remove, to alter, or to add to. It's what you choose to presence. And this is a fantastic project by French architects Lacaton and Vassal, and I actually heard Anne Lacaton speak about this when I was in Barcelona. And it's a urban square beautification project in Bordeaux, and it was one of a suite of squares that the local council had earmarked for beautification. And they went to the site and they had a look at it, and they came back to council and they said, right, you need some new gravel and a bit of pruning. And their design was to do not any more than that the space already was beautiful and it had an authenticity to it, which was a key part of that. So it's being brave enough to resist the commission, I suppose. Okay. So this is my parents' house in the inner west. It's in inner west suburbia. And I guess suburbia is really about connecting with garden. That's what it offers. So the project tries to connect the house better with garden. And the brief from my dad was no mowing. He was over it. And my mum just loved the solidity of the double brick. So taking the no mowing and the brick on as key parts of the brief, this project, my parents, retains and extends the brick and tile, essentially. So this is the existing house. We demolished a little garage that was there. We cleaned all the bricks by hand, and we extended the brick pavilion onto the house. And we reused the tiles as well, so it's just an extension. And then we introduced a couple of three little elements, timber elements that hover on the back. But more importantly, a connective ceiling. So it's sort of sense of a new ceiling which has light funnels and air funnels. So it's almost like a new sense of space moving into this old kind of shell. So the interior is made of whiteness. It's render, basically. just finishes you can see the thickness of it. These are the hovering elements on the back. We relocated steel windows and we added new windows and doors that were also steel, and then just made these multiple connections through the thickness of the plan to garden. And this is little diagram sections that show the ceiling and how it punches light and air funnels through the house. And then we added a third element, which are these oversized joinery units, which were sort of space-making elements. Staying in the inner west and then moving to a public scale, this is a Catholic primary school in Leichhardt. So this is Iron Cove here. And it's St Columba's primary school. St Columba is the patron saint of books and libraries, which is quite nice when you're doing a school. And you see this very sweet little church with a pitch roof. There it is there in the site plan. And the parish priest was, together with the principal, were the clients for the project. And the priest was very keen to presence the church in the upgrade of the school in some way. So architecturally, we let the church lead the way. That's as it was. You can see that was the original school building here, and this is a BER hall. So we undid the later works and we returned the Victorian curtilage to the church. And then we used that idea of the curtilage then to create courtyards. That's like the shadow of the end parapet wall of the old school, creating a little courtyard. This little entry courtyard, this is like kindy infants courtyard. Here's a courtyard to the parish hall. You can see that diagram quite clearly in that image. Importantly, this was the ceiling of the church with its pitched roof. And we used the idea of the pitched roof of the church to create a ceiling scape inside the school. So we retained the existing school building and we sleeved in this new piece here. So the idea is that the ridge height is the same height as the existing school, and this is the kindy and year 1, year 2 classes. So they have these sort of tall, peaky spaces, and as you move through the school, your space gets bigger. And it's sort of based on an idea that children actually have an incredible spatial memory, and that maybe they'll remember this in their school when they're older. Their school they'll feel the movement, the progression from kindergarten to grade 6 in this school. So it's not really a roofscape, it's more a ceiling scape. That's the bricks of the old retained school building. And then this is the sort of presencing of the church through the ceiling of the new school. And where the classroom element meets this entry space at the junction between infants and primary, and entry is the library, is the space of St Columba. That's moving through to the big kids space. Inside the church is this beautiful Wonderlic ceiling, and it has a pattern on it, which is the Ionic cross. St Columba lived on an island with all these Ionic crosses, and the Ionic cross is the circle and the cross together. So we decoupled those, and we added pattern to the ceiling in the library space as a way of resonating back with the church. So the church really presenced not only in the form of the spaces, but in their treatment, if you like, or decoration. So from a saint now to a master, namesake of this lecture, in fact. We won a little competition, invited a competition for a visitor interpretation centre at the Opera House, which was a little bit rather daunting kind of brief, really. And an interpretation implies reflection. So we were looking at these beautiful early images of the construction of the Opera House and the reflection of the water. And of course, Anish Kapoor's work, which was across the other side of Circular Quay at the MCA, the beautiful Sky Mirror project. We were looking to presence the heritage significance of this place in this little project. And for us, we interpreted that to be the sphere, that everything about the Opera House really emanates from the sphere, its structure, its form, its iconic nature. So firstly, we found a blind spot from the public domain, a little place where maybe we wouldn't be so in the way. That was the timid part. And then we took a sphere and we imagined the concourse like a crust. And we pushed the sphere through this crust. And the sphere made an opening. And that opening, if we mirrored it, you could then stand in the concourse and look up and see a reflection of the Opera House itself. And then the space underneath that would be where all the sort of visitor interpretation, ticketing stuff would happen under the concourse, not more junk up in the forecourt. So you can see here that's sort of what you would see in the forecourt, and then the rest of it evolves underneath. And then we got so far as to even prototype the material. So the Opera House some years back in the upgrade of handrails stockpiled all these original handrails. So we tried melting a bit, recasting it, and we were really pleased with the sort of colour rendering that you would get through the sort of mirrored brass, US naval brass of these handrails. Designing a house is an intimate experience. You delve into the narrative of people's lives. It also has a generic dimension. I mean, Stephen and I joke, if you tell us the size of the family, give us a suburb, we'll tell you what the brief is. But of course, you're looking to interpret the peculiarities and particularities of of the family that you're working with. I love this image. It's a universal mantle. It could be anyone's old lounge. But we all know the character of Alice and the scale shifts, the miniaturisation, the giantism that she experiences. And these are a nice segue into this next project. So you probably can't even see the site. It's 80 square metres. It's here. It's in Melara. And it's this middle terrace, so it's dealing with the typology of a row house. And, you know, the brief, of course, is how do you bring light and air to these old houses and connect them to the garden. That's the sort of generic of the brief. The clients are my aunt and uncle. And the brief my uncle gave me was, this is where my two speakers have to go. And he collects music and books. And the second part of his brief was a story about, a legendary story about a man who lived in a two-storey house, and he collected his books, collected books, until the second floor collapsed on him and he died under the weight of his collection. And he said to me, I don't want to be that man. That was his brief. And my aunt is simply just short. So you know, the lower level is cleared out to make a space that connects the street down to the garden. The upper level retains the cellular nature of the Victorian plan, also manages my uncle's issues of privacy. He's a very private person. But it may not have been, if I didn't have such a short aunt, that we'd make her a kitchen that's 4.2 metres high, and then a little sitting room that's only 2.4 metres high, and then a stairwell and a terrace that takes up a fair chunk of the plan. So in this project, we sort of discovered that even in a tiny little house, providing great variety of scale actually really adds to the richness for the inhabitants who live there. The recycled carry floor to give that sense of this folding floor. The material of the walls is almost irrelevant. They're containers of Leslie's music and books. And then we were keen in the typology of a terrace house not to feel like you're being sucked up the stair, that the living space can settle, because the stair's there, but it's not kind of a feature of the room, if you like. So the stair is like a little slot in the side, and it allows then Leslie in the bedroom to kind of communicate with Noel down in the kitchen. And then the little sitting room, and then looking down into this sort of handkerchief kind of garden. About an hour north of Sydney is McMaster's Beach, and there's this beautiful piece of bush, and our clients have this site here. And this is a beach house, so it's a second house for Robert. Here's Robert. This is his youngest daughter, and Anne, and they've got 3 other more grown-up kids. And the brief was, we want a house that's nothing like our city house. And they wanted a house where they could house all their toys, so clearly a table tennis table and a kayak, amongst other things. And they wanted a house where their friends could come and stay, but they didn't want them to stay too long. So they wanted their bedrooms to be downstairs for the guests and really as small as we can make them, and they'd be upstairs. And then they wanted to welcome the extended family for Christmas, but they didn't want them in the house. So the particularities of these people and the sort of spillage of functions, if you like, into the garden made this quite an interesting commission. So it's also, being so close to bush, also affected by bushfire. And of course, they wanted a no-maintenance house, which we all know doesn't exist. But the metal cladding comes from the low maintenance and bushfire aspects. So there's very little program in the lower floor of the house, which is why it's sort of top-heavy. This is the sort of section through here. And we called it the Undercroft Beach House because it sort of relates to a series of like 70s houses up the road, which are all that sort of Undercroft typology, where you see surfboards hanging out underneath and towels drying. The house steps up here so that you can see a bit of coast from the living spaces. This is the TV lounge area. It's very small. The only big space really is the dining room. And then there was a little shed at the back, which they were keen to keep as an outdoor bathroom, and we poured a slab next to it for the tent for the extended family. So literally there it is. When we took the roof off the old shed, it collapsed. So this is actually a reconstruction of the shed without its roof. And I don't think Robert's ever used the indoor bathroom. He only ever uses the outdoor bathroom. The Bunnings tent in front of the house. And then some of the sort of qualities of light that you get with this metal, when you use the metal and the timber decking. Robert was also keen to whale watch. So this is our roof access for cleaning, bushfire reasons, staircase. But the staircase is essentially outdoors. So to get from one level to the other, you go out of doors, and it, like in the terrace house I just showed, it's quite overscaled. It's almost the scale of a public kind of surf club with thick timbers. So when they arrive, they can open up. That's obviously where Robert stores his kayak. And we used canvas as a material of the architecture. In fact, it was really fun working with the canvas. The man who did all the stitching drove his van, and in the back of his van there was a sewing machine, and he stitched away making balustrades, and was great. But I guess that canvas connects to their love of camping and camp chairs and the kayaks and boat covers and those kinds of things. Okay. This is in Woolloomooloo, so it's the Juanita Neilson Community Centre, and this is the original shoreline, or the pre-reclamation shoreline, I should say. And this project is really a conversation between women, I would say. A project here by Lina Lombardi, who I admire greatly, for creating spaces that are very raw and very full of life. And this is Juanita Neilson, the namesake of the Juanita Neilson Community Centre. So the building was an 1888 warehouse, had lots of tenants through its life, and then the City of Sydney managed to acquire it and convert it into a community centre. And because it was located in Woolloomooloo, they named it after Juanita Neilson, who was the daughter of Mark Foy, but also an activist in the area to trying to protect heritage. And she was last seen opposite our office in a nightclub. And so she became a sort of a figure, both of these women dead, who we communicated with through the project. We also had Sue Barnsley on our team. Our design manager and project manager at the City of Sydney were women. Our steel form worker on site was also a woman. So it's a bit of a women's project, this one. And you'll note that, yes, the awnings are an ode to Juanita's stripy t-shirt. But Juanita was about protecting heritage. And I'll just read this little quote from Ignacio Soler Morales, Catalan. Antiquity is a subjective quality that produces a purely psychological satisfaction derived from a view of the old as a manifestation of the passing of time. And our strong sense was that in this demographic, old things give us comfort. They make us feel comfortable. And this is a place which is frequented by, rough sleepers or people who might have just come out of hospital or prison. So it was very important that we try and make a place where people would feel comfortable. So we tried to make this old building feel even older. So in its conversion, the council had cut an atrium, and the local community loved these trusses and they loved the atrium. So we sort of reinterpreted the trusses in the atrium, if you like. We had to pour a new floor to get equal access, and we brought to council this image of this beautiful dark green concrete. We were saying, it's like seaweed, and Beth Jewell, our client at council, who is sort of in charge of all the community centres, said, okay, two things. Green equals prisons and blue equals hospitals. So we said to her, we'll come back to you on the colour of the concrete. So it's the golden sands of Woolloomooloo. We just liked the yellow. But this is so as it was, and then after we had worked with it. And so what you see here is these are the original two-storey openings at the rear of the warehouse. And so we let, a bit like the Castle Crag house, we let the passage of time become legible in the architecture. Essentially, we moved all the services to the southern end. We paired double bays, each with their own entry. We cut a hole in the middle and made a staircase. This is a gym, this is the community lounge, and this is a after-school hour care facility, and upstairs are community rooms and a community hall. And very important here was that we create margin spaces, so it's a totally non-confrontational plan. We added a new roof, and we lifted up the roof over the atrium to bring in some light. And the stair almost magically folds up like a magic carpet, trying to bring a little bit of delight for these people. It also does recall Juanita and her zigzag t-shirt. And then where we could, on one side only, budget permitting, we strapped the handrail in leather, just giving that sense of warmth. So trying to become intimate or personal with the users who we didn't actually really know. Full of life. So one of the tenants was Firestone Tyres. They were there for quite a long time. So we pulled their red Firestone tyre colour into the community kitchen. So there's lots of little narratives, personal narratives really, that run through this project. This artwork is in the community hall. It's a curtain by Locust Jones, who worked again with the community to develop this artwork. And then the idiosyncrasies of the windows and the shutters for blockout in that hall. There's a ceiling that envelops the whole of the upper floor. An acoustic ceiling, which works with the zigzag. I mean, we really went to town with that t-shirt. So my final theme is sunlighting. So solar orientation is elemental. We all try to optimise passive performance in our buildings in order to minimise reliance on energy. Solar access is so fundamental that it's a touchstone of our planning legislation. And we think of it in these terms, but we also think of it more broadly in terms of natural light and its impact on the interior. And I'm just going to read a quote from Joseph Keck-Glass, who wrote in a book called Zenithal Light. It's actually Elias Torres, who's another Catalan architect. It's his PhD thesis publication. It's called Zenithal Light. And Keklas writes, as we often instinctively associate light with its source, the sun, and shadow with its limits, darkness, we assume that light is a phenomenon of the exterior and that shadow is a phenomenon of the interior. The opposite is closer to the truth. Only in interiors does light materialise and allow itself to be seen. The shadows are outside. And Elias Torres adds, for light to be seen in an interior, it must be imagined previously in darkness. So these final projects work with these ideas of sun lighting. So this is a house down in Victoria, on the Mornington Peninsula, between this kind of rugged coast where Harold Holt drowned actually, and the bay, and the sites here. Beautiful gravel roads and incredible landscape. So when we came to do this project, the landscape had already been designed and built by a wonderful landscape architect, Fiona Brockhoff. So the clients actually own all of this, and there's a little old house there that one of their sons uses, and we built this one previously, and then this is a house for them. So it's a house that's oriented to this beautiful garden that Fiona had designed. It was about survey. It has a big room that runs through the middle that connects the garden almost right through it. And then it's a sort of tripartite plan with views to the garden through the depth of the plan. And this is coming in through the entry, looking right through the middle of the house. So the project then works to correct its orientation for sunlighting. And it does this using two devices. This is looking back out to the landscape from that front terrace balcony. So it uses skylights to pull light into the interior, to balance the light and to pull light into the interior. And so this is a long skylight facing sort of northeast along here, and there's another one going in the opposite direction along here. And in this LVL plane ceiling, if you like, we needed some struts to stop everything from twisting. And they didn't need to be as deep as this, but we realised that by making them the same depth, we could create a crate-like ceiling, which would then enable skylights to be put wherever the skylights needed to be without interrupting that sense of space that was connecting the idea of survey and prospect. You can see how that, and then, even here, popping light down into the middle of the plan where it might otherwise feel dark. And then the second thing was to do with correcting the orientation for some of the windows. So this is a northwest facing facade. And so the client was very keen to cut out the heat from the summer sun. So these are adjustable coloured louvers. And the louvers pick up on the patterns of the colours of the landscape. And quite beautifully, they reflect one another. So even though reflect one from another. So even though we only had 5 colours, they reflect, I think, about 11 colours. And they sit quite beautifully in the landscape. And they create a moody interior. So this is from one of the bedrooms where the garden rises up and fills the space of the window. You can't see any sky. This is a much bigger building. This is an apartment building in Green Square. It's under construction. And as we all know, Green Square was never built on because it was a wetland. And we were at the southern edge of Green Square town centre, and every building moving towards the station, which is about here, was taller than ours. And we were on the edge to this sort of heritage conservation precinct. And of course, legislation is that you have to get a certain amount of sunlight to all your apartments. And we thought, okay, let's build the entire block because that's what the developer will want. Let's then cut out a piece to achieve a challenge of getting sunlight to the ground floor apartments. Then let's give a courtyard to the south to provide a bit of relief for our neighbours and to allow light and air to this back section. And then let's carve out an entry sort of spine, if you like. So that move that was based on sunlight then led to a large number of corner apartments within the plan. So that then led to us looking at the corner apartment as a typology. So it enabled us to split bedrooms, which we thought might work better for a mix of family types. And it enabled us to achieve wraparound balconies with flush floors to give a better sense of expanse of light in what are relatively tight apartments. It also created a major garden space. So again, here we're working with Sue Barnsley. And so Sue's worked with us to create this garden space, which also gives to the street as much as it does to the inhabitants of this building. And then the materials evolve out of that. So we've used green glazed bricks in the garden zone, and then a more sort of ephemeral materiality to the wraparound balconies on the upper level. We're trying to dissolve this building into the sky. I think everyone tries to do that the first time they work on something tall. This is our project at the Australian Museum. So it's a little project for a pretty big institution. And here we are at the sort of green threshold to the city from the east. And I love this image of the sunfish because it talks about how important the pragmatics are. They didn't work out they didn't allow for loading in the early plans. So our brief was to provide a new entry, a glazed entry on the north side of an institution which has 70 scientists basically researching climate change. We thought there was a bit of an issue with that. But the idea of it being glazed is the museum was trying to reposition itself as an open, 24/7 open living room, not a closed sort of dusty container of collections. So what this enabled the museum to do to achieve clear circulation to the centre and then circulate through these beautiful old kind of galleries. That was the sort of broad intent. So really the project was about negotiating the sun through glass. This is the William Street elevation. This is with the addition of the Crystal Hall. So you see it has a sort of a planar quality like the Parkes Farmer wing, this beautiful wall of stone, and then a filigree sort of like the Barnett face to the Lewis, the original Lewis Museum, which sits behind it. And this is it here in its context, the stone against the glass against the stone. It also provides a platform for engaging back with the city, and I think that was really important. So we sort of accepted that it was going to be a glass pavilion on the north face of the museum. So we were trying to avoid it feeling like a piece of corporate air-conditioned glass box from the city and feeling like it evolved more out of the museum itself. So we looked at crystals and the way crystals refract light, and we evolved a high-tech glazing system with ventilation and these giant shading diamonds, if you like. They have a pyramidal surface on the upper side, so that actually does help reflect the glare from the sun. And then they have a coloured interleaf which picks up on the colours of refracted light, and a dot frit pattern to assist with shade. So it's working pretty hard. It enables a transparency through the middle of the building. So this is high performance glass that's relatively transparent. If anyone knows their glasses, I'm sure there's a lot here that know a lot more about glass than I do. But sometimes becomes solid. It's got a very beautiful ephemeral quality to it that extends past the enclosure of the building, so it feels more like a screen than a glass box. And that speaks through its architecture to the architecture of the heritage buildings. And that provides this beautiful sort of shade. It almost feels like you're standing under the shade of a tree when you're in that space, and provides shade down to the public domain below. So this is a site where we've dug a big hole, a very big hole. It's Barker College up in Hornsby, and these are sports fields. So they're big. It's a big site. And the project is a sports building on one of these sports fields. And the school has beautiful philosophy, which is every child, every experience, every day. So it's about embracing all. So we felt that this project needed to be a celebration of sport. And in the same way that when Neeson is non-confrontational and tries to allow everyone to feel comfortable through the creation of margin spaces, this building tries to make those kids who don't really like sport feel like they're willing enough to have a go, as well as celebrating the sports heroes. So this is an early little diagram where you come in and you look out to the sort of vanishing point of green outside with sport in the distance and sport happening either side, surrounded by sport. The challenge of a sports building is structure, acoustics and light. So here's the field. There's an existing building we're retaining. We're wrapping car parking underneath. We're adding a series of classrooms and fitness rooms and the like along the field side, which is on the south side. These are the courts, 5 indoor basketball courts, netball courts, upper level with a bridge connection back to the street, and then a parasol roof, let's call it. So in its 3D, so essentially it's a linear sort of field building, if you like, and then the sports hall in between. And this linear building can then get light and air sort of on both sides, and this concrete structure and this excavation provide essential structure for this sports hall, which is trying very hard not to be a shed. Sorry, I'll go back to that slide. So we use sunlight in this project to help mediate the scale of the project. We use diffuse light down onto the sports playing surface because it's so deep that if you don't have roof light, you'll need artificial light in here. And we use diffuse light through this canopy to create a protective public zone and also to add extra shade from the north down into the sports courts. And then we use direct sunlight above the main stair so that parents arriving on a Saturday from their cars know where to go, all the way up to the top to the coffee. And direct sunlight on all the balconies and breakout spaces to draw people into those sort of more communal spaces. So this is that sort of upper entry area. Here's that staircase which goes straight down, sort of show court on one side, classrooms with their breakouts, and these are very important to achieve the kind of ventilation that we need, cross-ventilation we need to achieve in this building. And the canopy wraps around these sides. We like working with fabric. It's a fabric canopy. It moves in and out. It tries to pick up the sense of the topography. It provides a sheltered space to walk along, and it broadens out at the entry. So it tries very hard to negotiate scale. And then this is almost like a blown up version of the ceiling of that house I showed you, where we're creating a crate, which is actually a crate of structure. So it's 2 metres deep. It allows these basketball hoops to fold up into that zone. It's all acoustic, and then it also helps to reflect light as light comes through the roof, diffuse down onto the courts. Looking back the other way, and then from the court itself, and you can see here then how the skylights in these spaces really animate this building, which is also very long. There's that cratered roof sitting above this sports hall, and the canopy that invites you and picks you up and broadens at the entry and tightens where the land drops away. So do architectural ideas translate across scales? We believe they do, and we are interested in this inflection. It is usual to consider the personal in a house, but maybe not so to bring that thinking into the space of a community building or sports building. It is usual to look at the urban context for a museum entry, but maybe not so usual to think about the geological context of a house. We deliberately cross those threads of thinking. That way we are able to posit a house in the city and a child in a sports hall. Thank you.